My husband kissed me goodbye for a business trip, but he never left Seattle. Reaching for an empty glass jar on the highest kitchen shelf, what I found inside signed the death warrant for our 7-year marriage. It shattered the family that treated me like their personal cash machine. If you have ever had to burn down a bridge you spent a lifetime building just to survive, listen closely to how I reduced those traitors to ash. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Madeline Knight. I am 34 years old, and for the last decade, I have bled, sweated, and sacrificed everything to build my company, Sentinel Forge Technologies, right here in the relentless, rain-soaked heart of Seattle. I am a self-made woman in the unforgiving world of cybersecurity. Every line of code, every firewall protocol, every sleepless night spent mitigating zero-day threats for multinational corporations was a brick in the fortress of my success. People looked at me and saw a pillar of strength, an unshakable CEO who commanded boardrooms and outsmarted digital phantoms. But behind the reinforced steel doors of my professional life, my personal world was a suffocating web of unspoken obligations and quiet betrayals. At the center of that web was my husband, Julian. To the outside world, Julian was the picture of a thriving venture capitalist. He wore bespoke Italian suits that cost thousands of dollars, ordered vintage wines without glancing at the price, and possessed a charismatic smile that could disarm the most cynical investors. But I knew the reality. I was the one who noticed the subtle signs of his failing empire. I saw the discreetly shredded bank notices in his home office wastebasket. I heard his muffled, frantic phone calls at 2 a.m. Julian was drowning in bad debts, desperately shuffling money between failing startups to maintain his illusion of grandeur. I loved him, or at least I loved the man I thought he was when we married 7 years ago, so I pretended not to see the cracks in his armor. I gave him space, trusting he would figure it out. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was allowing my family to treat my success as their personal inheritance. My stepmother, Eleanor, never missed an opportunity to remind me that I lacked the innate grace of the upper crust. When my father passed away, Eleanor seamlessly took control of the family narrative, placing herself and her biological daughter, my younger half-sister Harper, on a pedestal. Eleanor viewed my relentless work ethic with aristocratic disdain. To her, I was just the blue-collar workhorse who happened to get lucky with computers. Harper, on the other hand, was Eleanor's masterpiece. Harper was the high society queen of Seattle, a woman whose only discernible talent was spending money she did not earn. She glided through charity galas and luxury boutiques, demanding perfection from the world around her. And who subsidized this flawless existence? I did. Whenever Harper overextended her credit cards, which happened almost every single month, Eleanor would call me. The script was always the same. She would use a tone dripping with emotional manipulation, reminding me of my duty to the family name and how a scandal would hurt my own corporate image. So, I would silently transfer $10,000 here, $20,000 there, just to keep the peace. I was the golden goose, tolerated only for the eggs I produced, as if dealing with Eleanor and Harper was not exhausting enough. There was Sterling Vance. Sterling was Harper's fiancé and a tech mogul who had inherited a massive software conglomerate from his father. Sterling walked into every room as if he owned the oxygen inside it. He was profoundly arrogant, patronizing, and utterly convinced of his own intellectual superiority. During our mandatory family dinners, Sterling would lean across the table, swirling his expensive whiskey, and proceed to lecture me on how to run Sentinel Forge. "You are playing too defensively, Madeline," Sterling would say. His lips curled into a condescending smirk. "Cybersecurity is about aggression. You need to expand faster, take bigger risks, But I suppose a woman's natural instinct is to nest rather than conquer. If you ever want a real man to take the reins and scale your little operation, let me know. I would bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. Swallowing the urge to remind him that my operation had proprietary algorithms his engineers could not even comprehend. Julian never defended me during these dinners. He would just sip his wine and nod along with Sterling, eager to stay in the good graces of a man with deep pockets. The isolation I felt in those moments was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I was surrounded by family, yet I had never been more alone. The breaking point, the beginning of the end, arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning. Julian was standing in the foyer, zipping up his sleek leather overnight bag. He had spent the last 3 days talking about an exclusive leadership retreat he was attending in the remote Cascade Mountains. He claimed there would be no cell reception, just a small group of elite investors disconnecting from the grid to strategize. "I will miss you," Julian said, his voice smooth and convincing. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt more like a habit than an expression of love. "Take care of yourself, Madeline. Try not to work 80 hours this week. Drive safe," I replied, watching him turn and walk out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving me standing alone in the deafening silence of our massive house. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and walked into the kitchen, entirely unaware that within the next hour, the fragile glass house I called a life was going to shatter into a million jagged pieces. I decided to do something entirely mundane to burn off the nervous energy buzzing beneath my skin. I would deep clean the kitchen. I tied my hair back, filled a bucket with soapy water, and started wiping down the marble countertops. It was a mindless task, but it kept my hands busy. When I finished the lower cabinets, I dragged a heavy wooden step stool over to the pantry area to tackle the uppermost shelves. These were the spaces near the 10-foot ceiling, places we rarely accessed, filled with dusty fondue sets and holiday platters. I reached into the dark, neglected corner of the highest cabinet, my fingers brushing against the cold drywall. There, hidden behind a stack of unused porcelain bowls. My hand bumped into something solid. I pulled it out into the light. It was a standard glass mason jar. At first glance, it appeared completely empty, but as I held it up, the weight felt wrong. The lid was unusually heavy. I unscrewed the metal cap and looked underneath. Taped securely to the inside of the lid with thick black electrical tape was a small, matte black solid-state drive and a shiny brass key. I rubbed my thumb over the key. It had a serial number stamped into the metal, clearly belonging to a private bank safe deposit box. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. My husband was a man who lived his life on the cloud. He did not hide physical drives in kitchen jars unless he had something terrifying to conceal. I left the cleaning supplies on the floor, took the drive and the key, and locked myself inside my home office. I booted up my custom-built workstation, isolating it entirely from my company network, and plugged the drive in immediately. A prompt demanded a 32-character alphanumeric password. It was encrypted with military-grade software. Julian thought he was being clever, but he had underestimated the woman he married. I build digital fortresses for a living. Tearing down a commercial encryption protocol was just a matter of time. I cracked my knuckles, opened a command terminal, and initiated a brute force sequence while simultaneously scanning the drive for vulnerability exploits. Julian was careless. He had reused a modified string from an old wireless network password for his secondary backdoor. It took me exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes to shatter his security walls. The progress bar hit 100%, and the drive unlocked, spilling its contents onto my monitor. The first folder I opened was labeled simply, Personal. I clicked on it, and my breath physically left my lungs. The screen filled with hundreds of high-resolution photographs and a massive archive of exported email threads. I clicked on a photo. It was Julian, his arms wrapped tightly around a woman in a microscopic bikini on a yacht. I zoomed in on the woman's face. It was Harper, my sister. My hands started to shake as I rapidly opened document after document. There were digital receipts for a luxury penthouse suite in downtown Seattle, chartered helicopter rides, and a diamond necklace that cost $85,000. All of it was funded through a secret offshore account. Where did the money come from? I cross-referenced the deposit dates with my own bank statements. The sickening realization hit me like a physical blow. Every time Harper begged me for money to cover her supposed debts, she was funneling it straight to Julian. I was financing their twisted affair. They were sleeping together on beds paid for by my sweat, laughing at my gullibility. I clicked on a recent email thread between them. The subject line read, "Retreat details." Julian was not in the Cascade Mountains. He was exactly 3 miles away, holed up with Harper in that penthouse. "I cannot wait for this weekend," Harper had written. "Just a few more weeks, Julian, and we will never have to look at her pathetic face again." The bile rose in my throat, but I forced myself to keep reading, moving to the second folder on the drive. This one was titled Project Icarus. If the first folder broke my heart, the second folder ignited a fire of pure, unadulterated rage in my veins. Inside Project Icarus was the complete source code for a highly sophisticated, stealth malware payload. I recognized the digital signature immediately. It was a Trojan designed specifically to bypass the unique firewall architecture of Sentinel Forge Technologies. Julian had used his access to my home network to quietly inject this dormant virus into my company's central mainframe. I read through the command scripts. The malware was programmed to wake up in exactly 14 days, rip the source code of my most valuable proprietary encryption algorithm, and silently transmit it to a secure external server. But who was the buyer? I opened a contract draft buried in a subfolder. The buyer was Sterling Vance. Julian and Harper were not just stealing my money, they were selling my life's work to Sterling. The final document on the drive outlined the endgame, and it was a masterpiece of pure malice. They had no intention of just walking away with the algorithm. To ensure I could never retaliate or sue them, they had fabricated a meticulous trail of forged emails and doctored financial records. These fake records made it look like I was the one selling my own clients' data to foreign cyber terrorists on the dark web. Their plan was to execute the theft, anonymously tip off the federal authorities, and frame me for corporate espionage and treason. I would be sentenced to at least 20 years in federal prison, with me incarcerated. Julian would use his status as my husband to claim power of attorney, seize all my remaining assets, and hand Sentinel Forge over to Sterling on a silver platter. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the glowing monitors. My husband, my sister, and her fiancé had built a guillotine, and my neck was already resting on the block. Any normal person would have broken down. They would have screamed, smashed the monitors, or collapsed onto the floor in a puddle of tears. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a biological waste of time, and right now, time was the only weapon I had left. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly evil, that it completely bypassed my capacity for grief and went straight to a cold, crystalline clarity. My pulse slowed down. My breathing became even. The devoted wife died in that chair, and the CEO resurrected in her place. I closed my eyes for exactly 10 seconds, mapped out every variable of their plan in my mind, and opened my eyes. It was time to go to war. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. First, the evidence. I compressed the entire contents of the drive, encrypted it with a 256-bit key, and routed it through 7 proxy servers before dropping it into a secure, anonymous cloud vault hosted in Switzerland. The upload took exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds, with the safety of the proof secured. I picked up my phone and dialed my private attorney, a man named Arthur, who asked 0 questions and charged $1,000 an hour. "Arthur, I need immediate structural reorganization," I told him when he picked up on the second ring. "Set up 3 shell corporations in the Cayman Islands by tomorrow morning. I am transferring 90% of Sentinel Forge's liquid assets, along with the patents for our secondary security suites, into a blind trust. Julian cannot have access to a single dime." Next was the payload. Julian wanted my core algorithm to sell to Sterling. I decided to give it to them. I opened the source code and began surgically altering the architecture. I hollowed out the predictive learning models and replaced them with a highly aggressive, self-replicating logic bomb. To the untrained eye, or even a competent auditor, it looked exactly like the revolutionary software they wanted. But the moment Sterling installed it on his proprietary servers and executed the initialization sequence, the code would mutate. It would silently bypass their administrative protocols, overwrite their root directories with garbage data, and permanently fry their entire mainframe within 45 seconds. I checked the time. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I logged into the global positioning system tracking application linked to Julian's luxury sedan. The digital pin glowed bright red on the map, stationary at an address in the financial district. I cross-referenced the address with my credit card statements. There it was, a recurring monthly charge of $18,000 for a luxury penthouse, billed directly to an account I rarely monitored. I stared at the blinking dot, feeling absolutely nothing but cold. Calculated resolve. Before shutting down my workstation, I had one final task. I accessed the external firewall of Sentinel Forge. I deliberately unpatched a legacy vulnerability in port 88, leaving a tiny, almost imperceptible digital backdoor wide open. It was the digital equivalent of leaving the back door of a bank unlocked. Julian and his hired hackers would find it, breach the system, and steal the poisoned algorithm, completely convinced of their own genius. The trap was set. 3 days later, the trap was ready to be sprung at my stepmother's sprawling estate. It was 8 o'clock on a Friday evening, the air thick with the smell of roasted lamb and expensive perfume. Julian had returned from his supposed mountain retreat that morning, greeting me with a tight hug and a rehearsed story about how refreshing the mountain air had been. Now, he sat beside me at the massive mahogany dining table, his hand resting possessively over mine. Across from us sat Harper and Sterling, while Eleanor presided at the head of the table like a monarch surveying her subjects. The pleasantries vanished before the dessert plates were cleared. Eleanor dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin and leveled a sharp look at me. "Madeline, darling, we need to discuss family business," Eleanor began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Sterling has a revolutionary new cloud integration project ready to launch next week, but he has hit a minor liquidity snag. He needs a financial guarantor to secure a bridge loan of $25 million. Naturally, we thought of you." I looked at Sterling. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "It is a formality, really," Sterling said smoothly. "My capital is tied up in overseas acquisitions at the moment. Your signature just provides a temporary safety net for the board. Besides, it is time you contributed to a real enterprise, rather than hoarding your wealth in that little paranoid security firm of yours. $25 million is a substantial liability." "Sterling," I replied, keeping my voice low and hesitant, perfectly playing the part of the overwhelmed wife. Harper scoffed loudly, rolling her perfectly manicured eyes. "Oh, please, Madeline, stop being such a dramatic tightwad. You sit in front of a computer screen all day wearing oversized sweaters while Julian does all the heavy lifting in your marriage. The least you can do is support the family for once instead of being so hopelessly selfish. Look at you. You look completely exhausted and miserable. No wonder Julian needs to go to retreats just to get a break from your depressing energy." I felt Julian squeeze my hand. It took every ounce of my willpower not to pull away and drive my steak knife through his palm. "Harper has a point, sweetheart," Julian said, his voice laced with suffocating, fake concern. "You have not been yourself lately. You are working 100-hour weeks. You are not sleeping, and your paranoia is getting worse. I am seriously worried about your mental health. Maybe it is time you stepped back. Let me take over the operational side of Sentinel Forge. I can handle the stress, and you can finally rest." The audacity of it was breathtaking. They were executing their plan flawlessly, right in front of my face, gaslighting me, degrading me, and maneuvering to strip me of my company under the guise of family support. "He is right," Sterling chimed in, leaning forward. resting his elbows on the table. Running a tech empire requires a certain level of ruthless aggression that, frankly, a woman in your fragile state simply does not possess. Leave the heavy lifting to the men. Madeline, sign the guarantor documents, transfer the operational control of your upcoming projects to Julian, and go to a spa for a month. We will take care of everything. I looked at the four faces staring back at me. Eleanor's greedy anticipation, Harper's spiteful superiority, Sterling's arrogant sexism, and Julian's reptilian deceit. A week ago, this conversation would have broken my spirit. Tonight, it was music to my ears. I let my shoulders slump. I manufactured a look of utter defeat, dropping my gaze to the table. "You are right," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I am so tired. I cannot fight anymore. If you really think this is best for everyone, Julian, I will do it." Julian's eyes flashed with a greedy, triumphant light that he quickly masked with a sympathetic smile. "I promise you, darling, this is for the best." Sterling immediately produced a thick leather folder from his briefcase, sliding it across the polished mahogany. I picked up the gold-plated pen resting beside my plate. I did not bother reading the clauses. I already knew what they said. They were taking the poisoned bait. I signed my name on the dotted line, legally binding Julian and Sterling to the very project that was about to annihilate them, and handed the folder back. The days following that suffocating family dinner were a masterclass in deception. Julian strutted around our house with his chest puffed out, acting as if he had just conquered the world. He and Sterling immediately took the supposedly lucrative contract I had signed and paraded it into the executive offices of a major investment bank. They leveraged the $25 million guarantee to finalize the acquisition of what they believed was my stolen core algorithm. I played my part flawlessly. I woke up at 5 o'clock every morning, brewed the coffee, and drove to the Sentinel Forge office as if everything was perfectly mundane. I greeted my employees, reviewed daily threat reports, and maintained the illusion of a woman completely oblivious to her impending ruin. But behind the reinforced glass doors of my executive suite, I was orchestrating a financial bloodbath. Through the Cayman Island shell companies my attorney Arthur had established, I triggered a cascading series of asset freezes. Every shared bank account, investment portfolio, and real estate deed Julian and I held jointly was suddenly locked down under a complex, impenetrable corporate audit protocol. Julian was completely broke. He just had not tried to swipe his credit card yet. As for Sterling, the trap was even more devastating. The guarantor contract he thought he had forced me to sign was actually embedded with a meticulously drafted poison pill. By using my signature to secure his massive bridge loan, Sterling had unwittingly triggered a reciprocal liability clause that Arthur had buried deep on page 47. Through a labyrinth of digital wire transfers and newly established holding companies, I routed the entire crushing weight of that debt directly onto Sterling's personal ledger. By the time the ink dried on his new venture, his entire tech empire was technically insolvent. On Wednesday afternoon, a thick, cream-colored envelope with embossed gold foil lettering arrived on my desk. It was an invitation to Harper & Sterling's extravagant engagement gala, scheduled for that Saturday night at the Grand Pacific Hotel, the most exclusive five-star venue in the city. I traced the raised lettering with my index finger, anticipating the exact moment my desk phone would ring. It rang exactly 30 seconds later. The caller ID flashed my stepmother's name, Madeline. Eleanor's sharp, commanding voice barked through the receiver the moment I answered the line. "You received the invitation, I assume. It was a mere formality for the extended society guest list, but I am calling to make it absolutely clear that you are not to attend under any circumstances." "Oh?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and perfectly confused. "But it is my own sister's engagement party. I thought family was expected to be there." "Please do not play the fool with me," Eleanor snapped, her patience immediately evaporating. "This night is entirely about Harper and her flawless entrance into the highest echelon of society. It is the most important night of her life. The governor is attending. Several state senators will be there. You have been looking completely haggard and thoroughly exhausted lately. Having you moping in the corner in one of your drab, uninspired pantsuits will only drag down the aesthetic of the evening and draw unwanted, pitying questions from the press. Stay home, get some sleep, and let Harper have her moment without your depressing shadow ruining the professional photographs. Understood. Eleanor, I replied smoothly, staring out my office window at the gray Seattle skyline. I will not ruin her moment. I will stay entirely out of her spotlight. She terminated the call without another word. I placed the receiver down and allowed a genuine, razor-sharp smile to finally stretch across my face. I had promised not to ruin her spotlight, but I never promised I would not burn down the entire stage. Saturday evening arrived. The sky over the city was a deep, bruising purple, threatening rain. For the past decade, I had dressed to blend into the background. I wore neutral tones, sensible flat shoes, and oversized blazers. I dressed to be respected in boardrooms, not noticed at parties. That era of invisibility ended tonight. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and aggressively pushed aside the rows of gray and navy business attire. Hidden at the very back, still sealed inside its protective garment bag, was a custom-tailored silk evening gown. I had purchased it on a whim during a security conference in Paris 2 years ago and had never found the courage or the occasion to wear it. Tonight, it was my armor. I slipped the heavy fabric over my shoulders. The silk was the exact color of fresh arterial blood. The design plunged sharply at the neckline and hugged every single curve of my body before cascading to the floor, leaving my back completely bare. I pulled my hair up into a tight, severe twist, exposing my neck, and applied a dark, matte crimson lipstick. I stepped into a pair of black stiletto heels that added 4 inches to my height. The woman staring back at me in the full-length mirror was no longer the exhausted, the compliant wife Julian thought he had easily conquered. She was an executioner ready to deliver the final blow. I picked up a sleek, black velvet clutch from my vanity table. Inside it, I placed a single, encrypted micromemory card. It was no larger than my thumbnail, but it contained the high-resolution photographs of their affair, the offshore financial receipts, the audio logs of their extortion plot, and the irrefutable digital forensic proof of the malware theft. It held the absolute destruction of 4 intertwined lives. I walked out the front door and stepped into the cool night air. I had not ordered a standard rideshare. Instead, a sleek, jet-black chauffeur-driven luxury vehicle was idling in my driveway, the engine purring quietly. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I slid onto the pristine leather seats, smoothing the blood-red silk over my knees, feeling a terrifying sense of calm wash over me. "Where to, Miss Knight?" the driver asked respectfully, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "The Grand Pacific Hotel," I answered, my voice perfectly steady and cold as ice. "Take the scenic route. I want to enjoy the quiet view of the city before the storm hits." The heavy brass doors of the Grand Pacific Hotel ballroom swung open, a solid wall of classical music, clinking crystal, and polite, suffocating chatter hit me. The room was dripping in cascading crystal chandeliers and heavy gold accents. 500 of Seattle's most influential figures, politicians, and business magnates were dressed in immaculate tuxedos and breathtaking designer gowns. Waitstaff glided through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with caviar and imported champagne. On the raised marble stage at the far end of the room, Sterling stood behind a transparent acrylic podium. Harper was beside him, wearing a custom white silk dress that likely cost more than most working families earned in 3 entire years. Sterling was holding a crystal flute of champagne, leaning confidently into the microphone. "To my beautiful Harper," Sterling announced, his voice echoing smoothly through the massive venue speakers. "In a world of constant change, ruthless competition, and corporate sharks, finding a woman of such pure, unwavering loyalty is the greatest investment a man could ever make. She is my anchor, my confidant, and the flawless future of the Vance legacy." I stepped into the center aisle, The blood-red silk fabric of my gown caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers. The polite conversations near the back of the hall died instantly. Heads turned one by one, a wave of stunned silence rippling forward through the crowd as they recognized the woman they thought was a broken, exhausted workhorse. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate, heavy pace of a predator that had finally, patiently cornered its prey. Eleanor spotted me from her prime seat in the front row, the smug satisfaction completely drained from her face, turning her complexion the color of wet chalk. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her water glass, mouthing my name in sheer, unadulterated panic. I ignored her entirely. I reached the stage and climbed the 5 carpeted steps with fluid grace. Sterling frowned deeply, lowering his champagne glass. Harper's perfect. Manufactured smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of utter confusion and creeping terror. "Madeline, what on earth are you doing here?" Sterling hissed under his breath, stepping aggressively in front of Harper to block my path. "You were expressly told to stay home. You are ruining the aesthetic of the evening." I did not even dignify his arrogant demand with an answer. I walked straight to the podium, shoved his shoulder aside with a surprising amount of physical force, and grabbed the microphone. With my left hand, I pulled the black velvet clutch open, extracted the encrypted micro-memory card, and slid it directly into the open media port of the central digital presentation console. "Good evening, everyone," I said into the microphone. My voice was dangerously calm, cutting through the heavy, oppressive silence of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. Sterling was just talking about loyalty. It is a truly beautiful concept, but I thought tonight, rather than just talking about it in abstract terms, we should look at some real, tangible, high-definition evidence of it. I pressed the execution key on the console. The live string quartet music cut off abruptly. The massive 80-inch projection screens flanking the stage flickered from the elegant, intertwined monogram of the happy couple to a glaring, full-color photograph. It was the picture of Julian and Harper on the chartered yacht, their bodies pressed intimately together in a sickening display of affection. A collective, deafening gasp erupted from the 500 elite guests, before anyone could even process the scandalous image. The screen shifted aggressively to another photo of them entering the luxury penthouse, and then a scanned copy of the offshore financial receipts showing hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled directly from my personal company into their illicit love nest. Then, the audio files began to play. Julian's arrogant, mocking voice blasted through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, discussing the malware injection and laughing about how incredibly easy it was to fool his pathetic, hard-working wife. Harper's voice chimed in right after, giggling maliciously about my eventual federal prison sentence and detailing exactly how she planned to redecorate my house once I was locked away in a cell. The ballroom descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Smartphone cameras flashed rapidly. Society reporters who had been invited to cover the glamorous event of the year were now furiously recording the screens, shouting questions over the noise. Harper let out a high-pitched, guttural shriek and covered her face with her hands, trying to hide from the blinding camera flashes. Julian, who had been standing near the open bar schmoozing with investors, dropped his expensive whiskey glass. It shattered loudly on the polished marble floor. Suddenly, Sterling's phone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. Then his smartwatch lit up like a beacon. Within a matter of seconds, half a dozen senior executives from his tech conglomerate, who were seated at the VIP tables in the front, were aggressively answering their own ringing phones, their faces turning pale with terror. Sterling put his phone to his ear. I watched the blood drain entirely from his confident face. "What do you mean the entire mainframe is gone?" Sterling screamed into his phone, completely forgetting the massive audience watching his meltdown. "Shut it down immediately. Disconnect the backup servers. Pull the physical power cables if you have to." It was far too late. The logic bomb had detonated exactly as I designed it. The moment his engineers tried to integrate my fake algorithm, the virus mutated and began overwriting their root directories with encrypted garbage data. His entire multi-billion-dollar technological empire was currently being erased into permanent, unrecoverable oblivion. Julian frantically pulled out his own phone, desperately trying to access his private offshore banking applications, undoubtedly planning to wire whatever stolen funds he thought he had left and run for the nearest airport. I watched his fingers tap the screen in a frantic, sweaty panic. "Access denied," I said, leaning closer to the microphone so my voice would carry over the shouting and the panic. "Your accounts are completely frozen. Julian, every single dime is locked down under a federal mandate for illicit cyber fraud and money laundering." Right on cue. The heavy doors at the very back of the ballroom slammed open again. They were not late society guests. A dozen federal agents and armed economic police officers marched into the room in full tactical gear, their metallic badges flashing menacingly under the crystal chandeliers. They parted the sea of terrified, whispering elites and moved straight toward the stage and the open bar. "Julian Knight and Harper Vance," the lead federal agent barked loudly, holding up a thick stack of authorized warrants. "You are both under arrest for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Put your hands behind your back immediately." Two heavy-set officers grabbed Julian, slamming him aggressively against the mahogany bar to secure the metal cuffs around his wrists. Julian was crying, pathetic tears streaming down his face as he begged the officers to let him call his lawyer. Another stern officer marched right up the stage steps and firmly grabbed Harper's trembling arms. "Sterling, do something. Tell them to stop this right now." Harper wailed, crying hysterically as the cold metal cuffs clicked sharply around her delicate wrists. She reached out toward him, desperate for her wealthy savior. Sterling looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. His life's work was currently burning to the ground, and she was the literal match that lit the fire. "Do not ever speak to me again, you miserable fraud," Sterling spat out, his voice shaking with uncontrollable rage. "This engagement is officially over. You and your pathetic, leeching family are entirely dead to me." He turned his back on her and violently pushed his way through the stunned crowd, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably in the firm grip of the federal authorities. Down in the front row, Eleanor completely lost her mind. She collapsed onto the floor, tearing at her expensive hair, clutching her chest, and screaming in agonizing humiliation as her flawless aristocratic facade crumbled into dust. Her golden child was now a convicted felon being walked out of a luxury hotel, and her precious family name was permanently, irrevocably destroyed. I unplugged my memory card from the console, dropped it onto the floor, and crushed it into tiny plastic shards beneath the sharp heel of my stiletto. My meticulous work here was finally done. I stepped down from the stage, walking right past Harper as she sobbed my name, begging me for mercy, pleading with me to tell the police it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I did not even bother to look back at her. I walked gracefully through the parted crowd, listening to the symphony of their ruin. I pushed through the brass doors and stepped out into the cool, rain-washed air of the Seattle night. The vibrant city lights reflected off the wet pavement, shining bright and full of endless, unburdened possibilities. I had completely burned down the bridge I had spent my entire life building, and as I stood there in the dark, the warmth of the roaring fire behind me felt absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.